Excellent. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. By way of introduction, my name is Mike Faust. I'm one of the deputy city managers here at the city. I'm joined by Assistant City Manager Rick Buss and Matthew Quick with the Kaufman Associates. First, let's just start with a brief apology. We did not mean to schedule this at the same time as the presidential debate, but when it got scheduled, it was a brief oversight. So if you are joining tonight, we appreciate it. If you are unable to join and we recorded it, you can go back and watch the replay to either watch it for the second time or enjoy it for the first time if you're enjoying the presidential debate. With that being said, as we fold in, I just want to highlight the purpose of today's conversation. And the reason we're here is to transparently share the efforts that are underway. We've heard a lot of different information out into the community, and our goal is not to advocate for an air park, it's not to discredit, it's simply to state the facts of where we are, what is going on, and we're going to do our best to do that tonight. We're going to answer the questions that we've received. We received just shy of 100 questions from folks, so they're filtered into the conversation, and we'll do our best to touch on each and every one of those. I will highlight there's some we won't. If there was things that were not relevant, we received questions about parks and about high school, and they don't fit into this context. We're happy to answer those questions in a different forum, but they just didn't fit here. A couple of key things just as we fold into the introduction. One of the questions we said was, well, it's an airport, why are you now calling it an air park? And we're going to touch on that in some depth, because although an airport is part of the feasibility review and study, really this is an economic development endeavor around an air park, and Rick will touch on that as we move forward. Another great question we've heard is, why are you talking about the what tonight instead of the why? We understand that that's an important distinction that we need to just get through, and that is, we felt it important to really talk about the what we're doing, because there seems to be a lot of misinformation in the community. And so by zeroing in on exactly the what that staff have been asked to do, then the why will make a little bit more sense. We'll come back in August and we'll talk about the why then. Tonight we'll highlight some of the efforts around site selection, but we'll get into more detail later in the year as the report from Kaufman is published. Another thing I want to highlight before we get into the agenda and really fold in is, it's important to note that $0 has been allocated to construction of an air park or an airport at this time. So we as staff have been commissioned to go study this, and we'll touch on that. Staff have recommended acquisition of land, but we have not been commissioned to start any construction. So it's not like this project is moving tomorrow. We'll touch on some of those times and those details as we go forward. Again, I introduced Rick and Matt, and they'll fold in a second. We're going to go through just an overview of the feasibility study. Matt will touch on site selection and some components there. We'll filter in some additional responses to your questions. So we're looking forward to having a great hour with you. Let me introduce again Assistant City Manager Rick Buss, who will start talking about the questions we received.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. Appreciate that. Oops, I got to go back one. Okay. Well, first of all, as Mike said, we had just under 100 submittals, actually 95 submittals of your questions. So we want to thank everybody for taking the time to submit those. As you can imagine, we had a lot of duplicates, and really fell into a set of categories. And so we put a chart together there to give you an idea of what were the most common categories of questions. So obviously, we get things on flight paths and noise. We get things about what is this going to cost, the history, economic impact, and that type of thing. So as we go through tonight's presentation, our goal is to answer those categories of questions instead of trying to answer every single question. Because in reality, we had just so many duplicates, but that's a good thing. So it means the community's speaking, has the same set of concerns. So thank you, Mike. I got to get used to moving our slides here. So a little bit of historical context. We think there's a notion, or at least we get a feeling there's a notion in the community that this is a new concept. In reality, the concept of an airport or an air park goes back to about the year 2000. Back then, there was a feasibility study that was done by the Kaufman Associates. That one said yes, it's viable, but really no action was taken. The council didn't vote for or against it or that type of thing. It was done and really just no action. But a very important distinction here is there was really no public involvement during that time. And fast forwarding to 2017, the city pitched a corporate airport as part of an effort to attract the Amazon HQ2 facility, which ultimately went to Virginia. There's a promotional video, and within that promotional video, a lot of things were promoted. One would be having an airport in the North Peoria area. It also had, the commercial core heavily developed, large buildings, and even had the Amazon HQ on the shores of Lake Pleasant. So we've actually put a link in on our website so you can view this for yourself. But again, there was no public involvement. And so when you get to 2023, we started a feasibility study. The council asked us, go take a look at this. Does it make sense in 2023 and 2024 to revisit this idea of an airport or air park because of the massive economic impact opportunity we believe it presents? So what you're going to see, what you have seen and what you will continue to see is this outreach and public involvement. And that's going to be a common theme that we very, very much want to drive home. So this is not this administration versus the last administration type thing. The idea of an air park and airport has been across multiple administrations. I went the wrong way. Apologize, folks. Okay, so this next slide is based on a recap of the feasibility study. And if you want to get a full presentation, you can go back to the May 7th video that you can get on the website. But this this slide has a lot of information on it. But really what the feasibility study told us was two things. Is there demand, and should we study it further? And the answer to both those questions is yes. The FAA has a kind of a guideline that says a demand of 10 aircraft says it's viable and you should go forward. If you look at the bottom part of this slide, you'll see the initial aircraft that is projected under demand is 80 aircraft. So what our council has said, okay, we see there's demand, let's study further. So as Matt will speak more in a few moments about the site selection study, that's just the next step of the feasibility study. I got to stop doing this, I apologize. Drive people crazy. Another item that we are continually hearing, and we really want to clear this up, of what aircraft would be going in and out of this aircraft or airports if it's even built. So this will not have any cargo or commercial aircraft going in and out. And we just really need to make it clear, because we've been saying this for several months, that that is not the goal here, but we continue to hear that, so we cannot make that more clear. This will not have cargo. This will not have large planes going in and out. This will not have commercial airlines. There's not going to be a Southwest airline or UPS flying in and out of this. And this, on the slide here, you can see the type of aircraft that would be going in. Small single engine, piston type, all the way up to small business jets. That's the target aircraft to go in and out. Let's see if I can do this correctly this time. Hey, there's one. So there's been many questions on runway length, orientation, flight paths, and similar details. So what we do know at this point is, in our evaluation phase, is the initial would be a runway to be about 5,600 foot, and then a potential expansion up to 7,500 feet. Again, neither runway is long enough for commercial flights or cargo. So we can't do it even if we said, oh, we're going to do cargo. We don't have the runway length to make that happen. We do have a general idea of what the runway orientation would be. It's going to be generally a north to south or south-north orientation. Another thing, one of the questions that we had submitted stated, I'm just going to read this, is Sky Harbor brought up some significant concerns to the City of Peoria and expressed willingness to work with the City of Peoria officials. How is the City of Peoria addressing those concerns, and what level is the Sky Harbor involved in the feasibility process? We've posted that letter, and as I said in the May 7th meeting, we agree with Phoenix. with their concerns. That's why we're evaluating it. They're also at the table. We are addressing every question concern that they have brought up, as well as others. We have what we put together, a technical advisory group that obviously includes City of Peoria staff, not elected officials, staff. You know, obviously Kaufman Associates, Luke Air Force Base, City of Phoenix, and you know, we've got the FAA, as well as a local resident who's also a pilot, a Estancia resident. Deer Valley Airport is, of course, part of the conversation because they are owned and operated by the City of Phoenix. So it's really important to note that the partners are engaged and they're waiting for all the facts to come out before a position is taken. So we get this a lot. It's like, well, what does Luke think? Or what does City of Phoenix think? Or what does this entity think? Nobody's taking a position until they have all the facts. And we're really at the beginning of gathering all these facts. Next slide here. Okay. So again, this is from the May 7th presentation. Why an Airpark? So economic development is a top priority for this council. Public safety, economic development, and water security are the top three priorities. And quite frankly, an Airpark represents a very significant economic development opportunity for the city. The feasibility study represents just one part of evaluating that opportunity. The site selection is the next step in evaluating that opportunity. And why we're doing this is because a really fully informed council can make fully informed decisions. And I think that's really, important here.
Yeah, so, if I could just add
absolutely.
to that point, Rick, we've received many questions, and this is one that keeps coming up of when will this be taken to an independent election or an independent vote? And the transparent response in that is the city manager or the city council manager form of government. The city council serves as the representative of the community. That's a representative form of government. And as such, that council is commissioned with making land use decisions. This land use decision, whether for it's an Airpark or for a residential environment, are land use decisions. They're informed by staff. They're informed by the Planning Commission, but ultimately the council owns that decision. With that being said, we've received questions from folks that say, well, what information and what key factors are the council looking at in consideration? And where I can't speak or we can't speak for any one topic that council members are looking at, I can tell you they've been very transparent with us. Many of them have said, I'm waiting for the facts to come in. Show me that it's viable. Help us understand what it would cost. Help us understand the economics of it. So many of our council members are still, on that fact-finding mission, and it's our job as staff, as they have so commissioned us, to bring back those facts so they can consider them and make a fully informed decision.
Yeah, and to that point, Mike, no matter where you are on the issue, we're going to gather the facts. So one of the questions that we had stated, I'm all for an Airpark in Peoria, as the city needs to be able to compete with tourism and business dollars with neighboring Glendale and Scottsdale. Why is there so much red tape, endless studies, and countless meetings? So again, doing these studies is to bring the facts so that we can make intelligent, fully informed decisions, or give the facts so that our council can make those decisions. So no matter where you are, on the position here, we're giving all the facts and we make decisions accordingly. Okay. So economic development opportunity, just to reiterate slides again from the May 7th agenda, is that there's been a lot of questions on the economic impact. And some people that question, are these valid numbers that are being presented? So economic impact studies are done by third-party independent firms that specialize in this type of work. So if you look at the Phoenix Airport system, this is a study that came out roughly about a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, that was done just on the Phoenix Airport system, which of course, Sky Harbor, Goodyear, which is owned by Phoenix, as well as Deer Valley. They came up with an annual economic impact of $44.3 billion. Back in 2021, ADOTS, along with a company called IHS, did a study that came up with an annual economic impact for the entire airport system in Arizona of about $121 billion. So when we fast forward to looking at the Peoria Airpark, people say, wow, $1 billion, and we say, hey, it's equivalent to having a Super Bowl in Peoria every year as an impact. It seems like a big number, but when you put it in context of the entire state, it's less than 1% of economic impact on an annual basis for the state. And you know, the $60 million of tax revenues that would be coming into the state and local coffers is something that warrants us to really take a good hard look at. Last one here. Okay. So why do we have economic development? And this is something that we touched on again at the May 7th meeting. So in general, you have to have revenue to provide capital and maintenance and operations for your necessary services. That's true also for your amenities. So whether you have roads or nice parks and that type of thing, you do have to have the dollars to not only build it, but also to maintain and operate those things. You know, bringing in the revenue through economic development, which we're talking about revenue that comes through businesses versus residential, helps keep your taxes low. Residential revenue on its own is not enough to maintain the level of services and the amenities that's expected of this community, and just be quite frankly. So the council and city management council is faced with this question. You know, do we pursue economic development opportunities like an Airpark? It's not the only one. We're looking at multiple economic development opportunities. Or do we say, well, we're going to cut services and amenities, or we're going to raise taxes? And so, you know, this council says pursue economic development opportunities. So that's a big reason why we're pursuing this in full force, to see, does this make sense, and does this generate the type of economic impact that will help keep the taxes low for our citizens, as well as you know, maintaining that high level of amenities and services for the community.
Yeah, Rick, to that point, we received a couple of really good questions, and one of my favorites of all the 95 questions we got read, and I'll read it. 10 years from now, what will be the negative impact on Peoria if the airport is not built? And I'll just replace airport with Airpark, because as Rick has touched on, the importance here is not necessarily the airport, but an Airpark and the associated tax revenue and jobs generated through an Airpark play. And that's a great question. I think a second interesting question that came was, who is the true beneficiary of this proposed project? And as Rick touched on, the difference between economic development and the implications on taxes, this is an important thing to know, because right now, in all transparency, the city tax base has not grown as the city has grown. And if you've seen any of the presentations we've done on economic development of late, you'll hear us highlight the fact that gross sales in Peoria rates of the lowest, or one of the lowest in the cities in the major Metro Phoenix area. And that's a detriment to our city. And so as Rick was highlighting, you know, we don't even need to flash forward 10 years. If somebody says, what's the negative impact 10 years from now? Well, the impact of not doing economic development is real in the next few years, next 2 years, next 3 years. And the council has very clearly looked at staff, and we've said, hey, there's really 3 options that come into play with that scenario. Number one, as Rick alluded to, you can reduce the quality or the level of services provided to the community. That's not palatable. Number two, you can increase the tax rate. We've clearly heard from the council that that's not something they seek to do either. And third, you can increase the volume of revenue within the city. Without effectuating change on the tax rate, by increasing volume, you can increase the cash flow into the system to maintain and hopefully increase the level of services, whether that's in public safety, whether that's in parks, whether that's in neighborhood and human services. So these are key things. Another important piece of question I think we received was, economic development in the city is not solely dependent on an Airpark, right? So why aren't we investing in revitalizing South Peoria? And I thought that was an interesting question. And if you've really watched and heard a lot of the efforts of late, we've really touted and highlighted many of the efforts going on in the southern part of the city, and they're great. You've had 1 million square foot of light industrial space come online over the last year. Absolutely fantastic for both jobs and for transaction privilege tax. You've seen a significant energy and effort around revitalization of downtown, and we've just recently entered into 2 lease-to-own agreements with restaurateurs to revitalize downtown. You've seen additional efforts in the P83 area with the common bond projects and the arrival of North and Postinos and Blanco, right, trying to attract those amenities into the city. And that's just fantastic, but it really needs to be even more of that volume generation, so that way service degradation doesn't have to happen, and you won't see a tax rate increase. So developments at the trailhead, developments in the Four Corners are all important, but those are only short and medium term plays. Thinking on the longer horizon, the lands that are out, and we'll talk more about the lands in North Peoria later in the presentation. These are key things for the city to be working on and looking forward to bring continued economic vitality to the city. With that said, we received several other questions, and this is a slide from the May 7th study session as well, talking about the benefits or possible benefits of an airport or Airpark. And before handing this off to Matt, who's going to touch on airport site selection, I did want to touch on a couple of the specific questions that we received, and then I'll hand it off to talk about site selection process. So just reading some of those questions, what benefits, and I thought this was a great question, what benefits will the existing, employed, and happy with the way things are voting residents receive should the plan come to fruition? And that's a great question. And part of that is, I'll say the main part is the economic vitality of the city needs an economic engine. Our city really doesn't have an economic engine that spurs that job base or even that tax revenue base to fund those services and keep our citizens working and returning their funds into the city, right? We leave our city to go spend money in other jurisdictions, and our tax dollars go with them, and as such, that puts a strain on the budget. We received another great question that said, will my family still be able to relax and enjoy the outdoors and fish in peace without the noise of continual aircraft from the Airpark? You know, that's a real, if you live in North Peoria, that's a real question. You hear planes in the sky, and there's no doubt that noise from an Airpark is inevitable. But I will say, and Matt will loosely touch on, part of their study with site selection includes includes environmental studies, so we'll have an understanding of what that could look like. And then I think one of the biggest questions we've had was people saying, I'm concerned about my house value. What will an Airpark do to the value of my home? That is a real consideration and something that needs to be evaluated. And you've heard Rick say multiple times that there's multiple studies going on, as many as 6 studies happening. Some of those studies specifically are economic impact studies, so we can understand the implications, right? Not only of jobs, not only of tax revenue generation, but also of impacts to existing properties, if there is any, and appreciation of land values should this move forward. So all of this is under consideration. And that's why doing these studies is so important, and that's why having partners like Kaufman and Associates is critical to this endeavor. So please, if you would, allow me to introduce Matt Quick. He's a principal with Kaufman and Associates. Kaufman Associates has completed over 1,200 airport planning assignments, which includes master plans for those, includes noise and land use studies, environmental documentation, and other complementary studies. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt and let him talk a little more about the site selection process.
All right, good evening. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Rick. You guys have done a good job kind of explaining the feasibility study process, which we've been involved with, and I do want to talk about the site selection study as well, but I think Rick did a good job of just highlighting kind of what went into the feasibility study. That was really heavily focused on looking at aviation demand in the region, and then focusing more in what potential forecasts for aviation demand could look like within the Peoria area, and then looking at the types of facilities, the type of airport that would be needed in order to accommodate that demand. So that was the feasibility study piece of that, which we were involved with the city on. And now as we move into the site selection study, I want to talk a little bit about that as well. And I think, you know, there's been questions and comments out there as to what does the site selection study do. And really the definition is in the name itself in terms of what it does, and where it will evaluate potential sites that could accommodate an airport site location, while taking in various levels of criteria, weighted criteria that we're going to look at. So we're going to look at criteria that would be conducive for airport development, and we're going to take a look at criteria that really doesn't support an airport in terms of the various levels and degrees that's needed in order to be able to support an airport. So that's really what the site selection study does. There's also been a lot of questions related to noise, like Mike had mentioned a while ago, and airspace, and we understand the importance of those, and that's a very understandable question and comment coming out of this, since we are talking about an airport and a related air park. So just, I talk about what a site selection study is. I also wanted to talk just briefly about what it is not. And noise and things like that are mentioned. It is not a noise study. Like Mike mentioned, there are degrees that we can look at within a site selection study that will study the noise impacts, but it is not an official noise study as it relates to the Federal Aviation Administration and their definition of what noise is and the impacts of noise. It's also not an official airspace study, but we are able to evaluate some airspace criteria as a part of this, and I'm going to go into more detail that here in a minute. It's also not an official environmental document that paves the way for the development of an airport. There's certainly environmental factors that we're going to look at in this site selection study that kind of tie itself to the various National Environmental Policy Act or NEPA categories, but it is not an official end-all in terms of being able to approve a particular site from an environmental perspective in order to build upon. So those are just some of the things that a site selection study addresses, and then some of the things that it doesn't necessarily address. Regarding noise, again, we understand the importance of that. Once we get in a better definition of these candidate sites and the potential runway orientations that are tied to these sites, then we would have the opportunity to study the flight paths in a little bit more detail to be able to look at what those potential noise impacts could be in those areas. Noise evaluation is typically looked at in much greater detail as a part of like an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. Depending upon the degree to which a proposed airport and an air park is funded in the future, the Federal Aviation Administration requires that certain environmental components be taken a look at. So that's certainly something that we would recommend moving forward if it comes to a point where there is a site that is determined viable for an airport and an air park, and that further evaluation is to be done. Then we would certainly recommend that the city do its due diligence in studying those noise impacts and being able to get a better sense of the impacts that it has, not just from a noise standpoint, but an airspace standpoint and an environmental standpoint as well moving forward. So just briefly back to this slide that you see right now, these really highlight the main elements of the site selection study. Again, we're going to look at just a general search area and better define that through some candidate sites. And I'm going to go through some detail here in a minute that looks at different GIS data layers to kind of help us gauge what that could look like. And then we're going to evaluate these candidate sites based upon a lot of different criteria. I mentioned runway orientation a while ago. That has a lot to do with wind conditions. It also factors in adjacent airports to the potential study area. Surface transportation is big. Proximity to sensitive land uses such as residential. We're going to evaluate that. Obviously terrain is going to be a big issue. And I touched on some environmental factors related to floodplains, wetlands, sensitive land uses, all that factors into the environmental side. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about airspace as well. But once we go through the evaluation of these candidate sites, really the goal of the site selection study is to come upon a selected preferred site to move forward with. So that is all kind of encompassed in the scope of work that we're doing as a part of the site selection study. So this next slide, I wish I had a pointer or a mouse that I could point some things out on here, but this, what you see here is just a general search area. This is kind of high level. We're going to hone in a little bit as we move forward. So you can see the highlighted area, that pink color, that is the city of Peoria boundary. So we understand through the site selection study that the sites that we look at are going to have to be within that pink highlighted area. You see a red rectangular box on this slide as well on the left-hand side. That kind of hones in a little bit further. We do some initial vetting. We look at mountainous areas. We look at already developed areas, and even hone in a little bit more in terms of where we should be focusing our efforts for these potential candidate sites for an airport and an air park. You'll notice that some of that red rectangular box extends beyond the highlighted areas of the city of Peoria. We understand that an airport or an air park needs to stay within that highlighted pink area, but we also need to extend a little bit beyond that just for our GIS modeling in order to get a better understanding of some of the features and how they could play in to these particular candidate sites moving forward. So that's on the left-hand side of the screen. On the right-hand side, this zooms in a little bit more on that rectangular red box. And again, when we start applying certain features such as mountainous and difficult terrain, which is kind of the orange color, when we start looking at already developed areas, the black coloring, that even further excludes certain areas that we can really focus on. So we start really honing in on some particular areas, and you'll see some landmarks on there. I think you can see those okay. You see Loop 303 that's highlighted. You see Lake Pleasant Parkway, the north-south route, and then you can see the State Route 74 corridor a little bit further to the north. So those areas that are highlighted in pink still, that aren't orange, that aren't black, those are where we're going to start focusing more of our efforts on, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail of that here in just a moment, but I'll hand it back to Mike in the meantime.
Yeah, Matt, before we jump into that, I did want to highlight, just back a slide and just mention real quick that where you said the site selection study will touch on noise, it'll touch on environmental, but it won't drill down. That's in subsequent phases. Those things are going to be required to be done. It's just not now, right? So as Matt said, starting at the 30,000 foot view and drilling it down and down and down and continuing to look for target sites, there will be deeper analyses required by the FAA should the council choose to go forward. Those will be done. For now, you get cursory reviews to start to drill down to say, yes, it's viable or this site's not viable, trying to get down to that last bullet, right? A selection of a preferred site. So now when you look back here, we get a lot of questions like, how close will this be to my home? Is it being built close to Trilogy? Is it being built close to Vistancia? And as you can see from here, the target area is what we refer to as the Peoria Innovation Core. It's that pink area. So if you really focus your attention, I think as we start to drill into the maps, and Matt will get into this more detail, it's really that LPP, State Route 74 area, broadly speaking, and Matt will drill in more. I think there's a couple of things we just wanted to highlight because we receive a lot of questions like, are you considering the distance from my home? I'm worried about this. We're very sensitive to that, right? We are very sensitive. And again, this whole idea or whole notion around a successful Airpark is really drawn from a comparison from Scottsdale Airpark. And so with that, it was only logical to go back to that as a comparative example again and say, hey, with Scottsdale Airpark, where does it fit? And a good couple markers to draw from is Kierland Commons, right? The runway for Scottsdale Airpark runs right within a half mile of Kierland Commons. In fact, there's residential within a quarter mile of that runway. And we've heard people say, yes, that exists, but those people knew when they came in. Well, as a point of reference, just as an example, should the target site be the old Pleasant Valley Airport location, as you can see on the slide, here's some reference points. Again, we've heard Rick mention a possible north-south runway orientation. Vistancia is 3.7 miles, but to the west of this location. West Wing is 3.5 miles south-southeast. Sonora Mountain Ranch is a good nearly 3 miles, 2.8 miles due east. And so all of these factors are being put into thought, and we just think it's important. Again, we have a comparative sample and an example site, right, to balance that against. And so one of the things, and we've had some folks do this, actually go have lunch at Kierland Commons and try to listen for what is a common, anything from single engine aircraft to a business jet sound like when you're having lunch in the area. What does that look and feel? That's a great comparative way to say, what might this be should the council choose to go forward? So we thought that important to highlight. With that, I'll turn it back to Matt to get into more detail on the site selection process.
All right, thanks, Mike. So this next slide, I don't want to get too technical, but I do think it's important to call out some of these layers. And this is going to test my eyesight here. Actually, I went to the eye doctor last week, so this is good. I can see this better than I thought I could. But as far as some of these particular layers that we apply to the site selection analysis to get a better sense of these candidate sites that we're evaluating. So major roads is the first one there on your top left. And these particular boxes that you see all relate back to that red rectangular box in the general search area slide from a couple moments ago. So you can see, again, we've talked about State Route 74, we've talked about Lake Pleasant Parkway, we've talked about Loop 303, and then some of the other arterial roads further to the south and how those can factor in. Roads can be a good thing and a bad thing for an airport site. I mean, you want good surface transportation and access, which actually is tied to that third box from the left. But also roads can serve as an impediment to safety areas and runway protection zones and things such as that. So those are all things that we have to factor in from a particular candidate site standpoint. Wetlands, that's another one. You can see there at the very top hand portion, you got Lake Pleasant and then some of the wetlands that fall south of that. We obviously have to take that into consideration from an environmental standpoint. Floodplains are a big one. So that's another thing just from an environmental perspective. We show a box there for Bureau of Land Management. And then we get into some other sensitive land uses. We've got, hospital parcels, school parcels, church parcels. All those would be considered incompatible with airport development. Nothing really shows up as it relates to our more defined search area that we're looking at right now, but those are certainly things to consider. Already existing development parcels there on the right-hand side of the slide. A lot of that's tied to residential development. Obviously, we want to be sensitive to that and looking at future candidate sites, so we're taking that into consideration. And then you've got what would be considered obstructions to the approach and departure paths of a runway environment that's tied to an airport. You've got communication towers, you have transmission lines, power lines. Those are all in existence within the search area that we're looking at right now. So those are certainly things to take into consideration. Slope and terrain, obviously a big one. One of the earlier slides talking about just the mountainous areas. There's some really rugged land up in this area. So you can see on this particular box, the darker green is the flatter lands that would be more conducive to support an airport and its environment. And then when you get into the yellows and oranges and reds, those are certainly some of the more mountainous areas that we're going to have to stay away from. So those are some particular data layers that we look at that kind of funnel into this next slide. And I think this does a good job of kind of visualizing what we're talking about. So on the left-hand side, these are all the different inputs that we put into the model. They process those, they come out with some raster data, and we process it again, not to get into all the technicalities, but what you see on the right-hand side starts to spit out this suitability map that we're looking at in terms of being able to better define the candidate sites. So the darker the color, the less conducive it is for the development of an airport and an air park. The lighter the color, the more conducive it is. So you can see in the search area, the majority is comprised of fairly dark colors to almost black in terms of us not really being able to further explore those. But there are some lighter colors, and those are the areas that we're going to really start focusing in on. Again, trying to bring a little perspective to this, I talked about the Loop 303. I think you can make that out. The Lake Pleasant Parkway runs north and south, and then the State Route 74 corridor. Those particular areas, as Lake Pleasant Parkway kind of dissects 303 and State Route 74, that's where the lighter colors are. So as we get more into this site selection analysis, those are the areas that we're going to start paying more particular attention to as it relates to the potential development of an airport and being able to accommodate the various facilities and the runways and the safety areas that would be tied to that. So hopefully that gives you guys a little bit better perspective of what we're looking at and really what we're starting to hone in on from a site selection standpoint. I also wanted to talk about airspace. We brought this up earlier on. This particular slide, it may look familiar for those of you who were in attendance or looked at the City Council presentation from back in early May. This came out of the feasibility study. We understand the complexities of airspace, and we understand that that is a major factor in looking at a potential airport site up in North Peoria. When you look at this particular airspace exhibit, I mean, there's a lot here to dissect and digest, and just to try to stay high level. If you can make out the former Pleasant Valley Airport site, that's the general search area within those parameters. That's kind of what we're looking at right now. You can see various levels of airspace that it's tied to Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. All those dark blue colors and lines all constitute various levels of what's considered Class Bravo airspace that's tied to the Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. So that's something to take into consideration. Another thing is just about 11 miles to the southeast of the search area is Deer Valley Airport. We talked a little bit about Deer Valley earlier on. So obviously the airspace that's tied to Deer Valley is something to pay particular attention to. Luke Air Force Base is another one. Luke Air Force Base and its associated airspace and special air traffic rules to the southwest of really adjacent to the search area. So We understand the complexities, and that's why we are studying this in more detail. We actually, Kaufman Associates, we wouldn't consider ourselves to be experts in airspace. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes and the technicalities of that. We have brought on who we would consider an airspace expert to aid in this particular process. And they're going to be looking at various levels and degrees of the airspace and functionality to the Class Bravo airspace with Sky Harbor, the proximity of Deer Valley to the southeast, Luke Air Force Base to the southwest. So we are going to consider those and take that into consideration as well. Another airspace feature to keep in mind is what's called Part 77, imaginary surfaces. That is something that we can do in-house and that we will look at. And again, a lot of that is based upon the traffic pattern airspace that's around an airport, the imaginary surfaces that are tied to making sure the runway safety areas are clear, the approach and departure paths are clear. So we're going to be able to study those Part 77 surfaces, and then we're also going to bring in that airspace expert to do some more analysis on the traffic patterns, on the potential for instrument approach procedures, and if they could be contained within this particular search area, and then also factor in, obviously, the airspace tied to Sky Harbor, Deer Valley, and Luke. So all that's being undertaken right now. Also, we understand that airspace factors in with noise because those airspace corridors where those aircraft are flying, oftentimes the noise is going to follow that. So we will be looking at those sensitive land uses as it relates to the airspace moving forward in the site selection study. And again, more detailed airspace analysis will come outside of the study. We're kind of early just vetting it at a higher level. The Federal Aviation Administration or the FAA, they have a say in airspace, obviously, through their various lines of businesses with air traffic and flight procedures. So they would study this in more detail beyond the site selection phase of this whole process. But again, it's been mentioned, we're in the exploratory phase right now. We've talked about the feasibility study and shown that there is demand for aviation in this area. We're getting into the site selection study right now to vet some of these candidate sites from an environmental perspective and be able to look at airspace and things like that. But these are still in the exploratory phase. There's a lot of work to be done, obviously, after that if the city chooses to move forward with a potential viable site. So stay tuned, more to come as we move through this site selection study process through the remaining next several months. So thanks for the time here, and I'll turn it back over to Mike.
No, thanks, Matt, for that. And just by way of kind of timeline, I mean, we've kind of earmarked the end of the calendar year to get an update on that. And so we're going to be providing information along the way. We said in August we'll provide a fiscal review, the why behind this in August. And then, latter part of the year we'll come back with the output of the Kaufman Associates. And they've been great partners to help us think through the complexities of this discussion. The next 4 or 5 slides in our final 20 minutes or so are going to focus on some of the, I'll call them more operational related questions that we received. And so I want to start with the first one around land and infrastructure, because there's a couple of just big overarching conversations that are out there. And the first one really is, we've seen a slew of questions, probably comments more than questions of, well, you're going to destroy the open space that we have, or the preserve that's up near the lake is going to be impacted by this decision. And it's important to note that when you look across the city, specifically North Peoria in particular, lands north of State Route 74 are predominantly BLM land, which have an underlying use for recreational. That's north of State Route 74. But when we look in this, and what we call Peoria Innovation Core, really that pink area that Matt was highlighting in the previous conversation, that's predominantly state trust land, which is managed by the Arizona State Land Department. And it is important to note that that is not open space. That is just undeveloped land. And although it's a government entity, it's essentially the same as a private land owner. That land will be developed in time. In fact, State Land Department has a constitutional responsibility to sell that land for future development at its highest and best use for the benefit of its beneficiaries, which in this case is K through 12 schools, which is a major way that we fund K through 12 education here in Arizona. And so this land will come to market and it will develop. As a city, what we're trying to do is play a very thoughtful and mindful role in how that comes together. We've heard other questions like, okay, so if it develops, it's just going to be a industrial use, or it's going to look like a major warehousing space that we see at 303 and Loop 303 out in Goodyear. And one of our roles as city staff is specifically to apply the city code and the design standards that exist. We are very mindful as a staff. We do not want our city to develop like the Loop 101 down in Glendale, right? Where just development goes wherever development wants. We want to be very thoughtful. We want the healthy balance between retail and commercial and housing and jobs and light industrial, and how do all those things work cohesively for the longevity of our community. Because we're talking about a long play, 20, 30 years worth of development. And so it's very important that a lot of thought is put together. So when we get questions like, how do you cut the red tape? It's really about how do you be very mindful about how these things come to fruition. With that in mind, we received a bunch of questions on infrastructure planning and intelligent growth. And it's important to note that infrastructure, especially up in North Peoria, is necessary with or without an Airpark. And so I would encourage you to go out and look at the city's capital improvement program. We have a 10-year look, $1 billion worth of investment over a 10-year period that focuses on water and wastewater treatment and roadways and improving circulation and specifically addressing traffic safety and movements throughout the city. So all of that's been deeply, deeply contemplated, especially in this area when we're targeting the Lake Pleasant Parkway, State Route 74. We're currently studying a design concept report right now to widen Lake Pleasant Parkway and consider what a proper intersection looks like at LPP and State Route 74. So all of this has been considered and is being further evaluated. And so with that, I'd encourage you to review the capital improvement program. You can go back and look at the budget study sessions from earlier this year where we spend a large amount of time speaking to council about these programs. Lastly, before getting away from land and infrastructure, I will talk about electrical demands, because electrical demands are an important concept that need to be thought through. And with electricity, it's the best way to probably say it is, it's not a function of if electricity will be available, it's a function of when. Especially large electrical users, APS is looking out into the future and planning these things out with jurisdictions, with developers. So those are key things to consider in all things that are on the conversation right now. As we move into these last couple slides, I'm a little fearful that the content might be a bit underwhelming. And I say that because we received, as Rick went through the 95 questions, the second highest number of questions were about the finances of all this. And our takeaway from that was people believe we're much further along in this evaluation process. And I like the question Rick read earlier where somebody said, how do you cut the red tape? How do you get through this faster? Why all the meetings? And it's important to really spend time in this evaluation phase, investing time wisely so that way we can make the best recommendations to council so they can make fully informed decisions. So where we have a lot of this thinking out there, there's still not all the facts back. And we will touch on the information we do know, we'll touch on the things we're working on and the things we don't quite know. One thing that's raised a lot of questions though is land acquisition. So where we're out studying the viability of an Airpark and the potential for one might be, one of the recommendations staff has made to the council is it is wise to get out in front and go after land early. It is important to acquire land at its lowest, the cheapest price. So it is contemplated inside of the FY25 budget to acquire land, to put a down payment and have subsequent years of interest payments on that land. So that is contemplated. But it is very important for all of us to recognize acquisition of land does not wed the council to an airport decision. Right? It absolutely does not tie their hands to go to an airport. Acquisition of land, especially land at its lowest price, is actually an appreciable asset and a benefit to the city. Just like if you bought your house, nobody wants to buy a house for $250,000. Well, we want to buy at $250,000 to sell at $500,000. You don't want to buy at $600,000 to sell at $500,000. So getting land early before all infrastructure is available or before other land values raise is actually a wise decision. And if the city chooses not to advance into an airport or an Airpark, It could still serve as an economic engine. It could be sold. A lot of different plays could be had, and the council could consider a lot of things. A large part of the questions we got is, what is it going to cost to construct? And in the feasibility study, there was some discussion on, based on the prototypical airport, what will this cost? And I think the number that's in there is about $150 million. It targeted $50 million for land, about $100 million for construction. It's important to note that that was a rough order magnitude number associated with a prototypical airport. As Matt talked through the various constraints in the GIS layers, those are all problems that have to be solved should the council choose to go. What do you do with roadways? What do you do with topography? What do you do with power lines? All these components go into what it costs, and they're all things that we're studying now. As Kaufman is completing their study, the city staff are unpacking these things and understanding. There is no planned timing or budget approved for construction. Right now, we're simply collecting the facts to be able to bring back to inform the council so they understand the implications of such a decision. With that being said, there's also a big conversation of, hey, what will it cost, but where will the money come from? Where will my taxes go up as a result of this? And I think it's important to know that there's more than one way to fund an airport. And Rick touched on this in the May 7th study session, and I'll just highlight, in probably the simplest way to say it, is if you go the publicly owned way and you follow an FAA process, right, it's possible to have up to 95% of the cost of construction available for reimbursement. There's also the opportunity to go fully private. So it's possible the city acquires land and goes down this pathway and the council says this is wise. And then we go out and seek private development partners to develop this as a private airport. That's a viable option too. There could be a combination where it's publicly owned but privately developed. These are all things that need to be understood, they need to be unpacked more, and they need to be brought transparently back to forums like this to advise the direction where this is going. In line with the acquisition of land and the construction costs and the funding, we've got a lot of questions around how will it operate, right? Most people look at Airparks as a lost leader, right? As a losing, it costs more money to operate than it generates. And it's important to know that we're sensitive to that. The final bullet on this slide highlights the direction we've gotten from council is that the Airpark must be self-sustaining. And so that's when you hear us speak, we talk about an Airpark. We will not talk about an airport because one plays off the other. Secondly, and probably most importantly, is the play here is for an economic engine. Rick touched on the importance of economic development, the importance of the growth of the city and the economic and the tax base following along with it so we can maintain service levels and we can continue to provide the level of quality that exists in our community. So these things are all important factors that are being considered as we move forward. But it is important to note that because we haven't fully vetted a site selection or the cost to construct or the method by which it'll be funded, it's also difficult or impossible for us to say what the operations are going to look like. I know one of the questions we received was, can we get a 10-year pro forma of how the airport will operate? And I would say, we can't, because we're not to that point yet. We're still to the point of site selection and understanding what construction would look like. So those analyses are still underway. Our hope is that, in this time next year, we'll be at a spot to have those conversations. And inside of that, we're considering lots of things that came up in questions. Are we considering, when you say the term VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing aircraft? Are we considering the future of aviation? Yeah, those things are being considered. Hours of operation, we're sensitive to those things as well, but we're not to that point yet. Ongoing operational expenses, again, we have been commissioned to go out and find something that is self-sustaining, to find something that serves as an economic engine for the city, and that's our marching orders, and that's what we're going after. But that information is not known at this time. So that full detailed financial analysis, we think we're 6 to 12 months away. So as the site selection starts coming in and we hone those things in, we'll move from honing in the cost to construct to how it's going to be financed to ultimately how the operations of said environment would work. A couple of questions that came in, I said we wouldn't touch on. We're not going to get into each of these. Again, tonight we wanted to highlight Airpark, and really drill in on things that are relevant for just today's conversation. And to that point, should you need additional information, should you want to dig into this deeper, we'd encourage you, if you go to the city's homepage or website, scroll down, you'll see the council priorities. Under economic development, you'll see one that says Airpark, and in that you can drill into this content. So the Airpark fact sheet, which has been there since June of last year, provides information. The feasibility study that we've talked so much about tonight is in that site. Additionally, you'll find the 2017 video that highlighted a corporate Airpark. You'll see the feasibility study 1 and 2 from 2000. You'll see the economic impact memorandum that has been brought to us by Rounds Consulting Group. We'll be back in August, as we said, to talk more about that. So all of those things are out there. This video will also be posted in a link there, so that way all of these things can be seen, they can be examined, they can be unpacked. Our goal, as the city manager has asked us, is to be transparent in where we are. We are in the midst of a deep analysis for an economic engine, right? An economic engine for the city. We know that an airport is viable from a demand standpoint. We don't know if we have a viable location for one, right? We think we might, and so Kaufman's zeroing in on that. We understand the implications of infrastructure and construction, and we're getting more facts to understand the costs associated with those implications. More importantly, we understand the importance to the citizen about creating a sustainable economic engine that is not a drain and does not impose net new pressures on the tax base. We get it, we understand it, and as staff, it's our job to pull those things together and bring them back to council for their consideration. So as we wrap tonight, we know there's some folks who chose to watch the presidential election. We appreciate those of you who chose to watch us instead. If you would like to re-examine anything we said and unpack any of that thinking, the links in the presentation will take you to videos. We'll get those video links up probably tonight so they can be watched. And for those people who chose to watch the presidential debate, then they can enjoy the rest of their evening watching the video that we produced for you this evening. So want to really thank each of you for calling. Want to thank Assistant City Manager Rick Buss. Want to thank Matt Quick for joining us and providing some meaningful information. We greatly appreciate your time. We look forward to future engagements and dialogues along these lines, and we just thank you again for being actively involved in giving us the questions and challenging us to be able to present the facts to you and the facts to the council so fully informed decisions can be made. With that, we appreciate your time. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.